Welcome to MIT versus Caltech, where we discuss ideas, life, meaning, and technology. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the hypothesis that we are all living in a simulation. I'm Sam.
And I'm Abe.
So let's get into it. If you're not familiar with the simulation hypothesis, it basically goes like this. It's that humans are getting so advanced that we're creating simulated worlds. And within those simulated worlds, it stands to reason that the simulated entities in those worlds are going to be increasingly sophisticated. And not only are we making increasingly sophisticated worlds, but we're making more and more of them. So the theory is that some beings got advanced enough and then possibly created the world that you and I are living in right now. And it's actually more probable that that has happened than the alternative, which we're the original creatures that evolved and invented technology, and now we're creating the first ever simulations, at least on Earth. They're suggesting that's far less likely than the likelihood that beings came before us and simulated our world. And the trick here is that you can think of this going back even further. So the beings that simulated our world are likely also living in a simulated world that they're not aware of, and you can keep going back. Abe, I just want to touch base with you. Is this a theory you have given any thought to or heard about?
I mean, yeah, it's a theory I've heard about for sure. And I think that it echoes through literature for a long time in terms of people who wonder if we're living in a dream, right? So there's this whole question of what is consciousness, the questions of what is the origin of humanity, of the universe. For me, I don't think about it a lot because it doesn't have a lot of utility for me. Whether if we're living in such an advanced simulation as it seems like we are, then it doesn't really matter if it's a simulation or not. It's my existence. I perceive things. I interact. There's never been anything where I can't think of a reason why I'd spend a ton of energy deciding one way or the other on it. So I'm curious how you feel about that. And then the other thing is, I was thinking from usually when we make simulations, it's to learn something. And within those simulations, you usually make some simplifying assumptions or abstract some things to make it kind of less than your full world so that you can get to some answer faster. And that's where I am. I think the only utility I have in thinking about the broad scope of the universe or existence is just to remember to keep perspective, this idea that the universe is big, whether it's simulated or not. It really seems infinite in time and space. And, as I've said on a previous episode, it just makes me feel very thankful for my time here, and that the time here is precious.
Yeah, I like the one thought you have is what's the value in even knowing? And I think that's one of the fundamental questions is if somehow the creators communicated to us, or we found out somehow that we were living in a simulation, how would it change your day-to-day life? And the answer is, I don't personally know, but I think if we were to learn the rules of the simulation, that would be worth knowing. For example, Hollywood has done a lot of takes on this, and one of the more recent ones is a movie called Free Guy. And if you haven't seen it, the basic premise is this AI character in a video game basically wakes up and becomes conscious and becomes a sentient being. And there's every reason to believe that this could happen in our lifetimes. Some people think it's impossible for AI to be sentient. Other people believe that it is possible. That's another philosophical discussion. But certainly AI is going to be able to mimic that it's sentient, that we would not be able to distinguish between a sentient being and an AI mimicking sentience. That, I think, will for sure happen in our lifetime, where we won't know, is this being sentient? It will be able to fool us that it is. I think that is almost guaranteed to happen in our lifetime. And I think a lot more rapidly than people think. But in that movie, Free Guy, they basically let him know, hey, you are in a simulation. And the value to that is that he starts to understand how he can create and control the world that he lives in. In the early part of the movie, he felt very confined into a very small existence where he did this repetitive day over and over and day in and day out. And he had very little money in his bank account. But once he started to realize, oh, I'm in a simulation, he could start interacting with his environment differently. So I think that's one reason why I would actually love to find out if I'm in a simulation, basically try to find out, well, what are the limits? What are the parameters? How could I navigate this environment differently? And if the answer is you can't, then I don't think it changes how you do your day to day. But if the answer is, oh my gosh, you can do these things and you can do them differently than you're doing, then I think there's absolute worth in knowing that we're in a simulation. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense. And I mean, there's the, the Matrix is a classic example of the living in a simulation movie. But for me, my assessment is if we're living in a simulation, it's not even that, our consciousnesses are held in some, let's just say, computing machine, right? For me, the simulation is like on the, fundamental physics, quantum level, that, this space exists in theory. And I'm not even sure like that I would presume that human beings are like the observed, part of the simulation, like that whoever the creators are care what we're doing, right? I mean, we've pushed a bit in terms of space. I mean, it's entirely possible that the Voyager satellites have actually hit the edge of the simulation and we're getting, the creators fake the radio responses from those things because, we are in fact the subjects of this simulation. But to me, yeah, it just seems like and my conclusion is like, if we're in a simulation, I really feel like it's this, physics experiment setup that has just been let go to run. And yeah, that's where we are. I don't think that I don't view it in the same way as like how we set up like Sim City or something like that, where it's a mirror of, our situation to just kind of see how like different ways that cities or societies or people might evolve. So for you, do you think of it in terms of that we are the subjects of the simulation, or that like the universe, the physics of our universe is the subject of the simulation?
Without answering that, I do want to talk about what would even be the reasons to do a simulation in the first place. And then I think we can come back to that good question. First of all, I think most people agree on this, that you start with, why do we simulate things? And then you can go from there. And so one reason we simulate things is for entertainment. Video games would be a classic example. Really, a video game's only value currently is for entertainment. Another reason you might run simulations is for research or science, or for investing. So you set up certain parameters and you're basically having that simulation do work for you, so that you don't have to do it in the real world or in a lab. It's like, well, I can have a computer solve this for me. And there's lots of different takes on that. For example, what are the odds that a football team might make it to the Super Bowl? That's actually a really hard answer to calculate, but you can run simulations. So you can set up football games in a simulated world and just like run several million football seasons. And then based on that, you say, well, okay, the Bucks have this chance to win the Super Bowl, yada, yada. And so it turns out those simulations are much easier to do than to basically try to use equations and first principles to calculate something so complex. So those are the main two reasons that I can think of for simulation. Is one, entertainment, where they would be basically watching possibly humans. I think that's a lot of the Greek gods are about, the Greek gods kind of made a soap opera out of humans, right? And so if the Greek gods were the simulators and the humans were in the simulation, they were observing the humans. The humans were the important part of that simulation. If quantum physics is the reason that all of this universe exists, then I don't think humans are a very big part of that, right? So I think it does depend on, why is this simulated in the first place? And we don't even know if it's simulated, but let's assume it is for a second. Why else? And I'll pose this question back to you. Why else might we simulate something, or why might someone have simulated everything we're experiencing right now? Other than to get work done for research or information or for entertainment value?
Yeah, I mean, so it's tough on a few levels, right? To conjecture about what a being who could create this simulation would care about, right? There's a lot of anthropomorphizing there, trying to yield human or give human qualities to some being we don't know about or some consciousness or entity. I mean, I'd say the other thing is just to create in one's own likeness, right? So you've said entertainment and work, but there's also legacy. So, in terms of things that drive human behavior. And I can actually see Sam pointing his finger, so he wants to talk about this. Sam, what do you think?
Oh, I was just agreeing with you that legacy is certainly an important one. And that's another part of this show I wanted to talk about is the concept. Some people call it a computing singularity, whatever you call it. It's this idea that if I can get enough information from my brain into a computer, basically that version of me could reply to emails, and people wouldn't be able to necessarily distinguish, did the email come from biological Sam, or did it come from the uploaded digital version of Sam, or the quantum version of Sam, the quantum computer version of Sam, if we get to that point. And this idea is not new. It's not necessarily a matter of if. A lot of people it's just a question of when. And some people think it's just a matter of a couple of decades away. 2045 is the most common number you'll hear just based on Moore's law. But some people think it might be centuries away. And so if humans are still around and still advancing technologically on the century time scale, most people believe that we will be able to create a version of us in some digital type space or some computing type space that'll be largely indistinguishable from us. Will that version be sentient? Again, I don't know if that version will ever be sentient. But I did want to bring this back to, that creates a legacy, right? So now I can go on in perpetuity. I can make as many copies of myself as I want. I can basically live indefinitely, or that version of me can live indefinitely. So now suddenly you have a legacy. And one obvious reason to create a copy or say 100 copies yourself is to do all the little work that you don't want to do. That version of you could take a first stab at all your emails, and then you could review them before you sent them, but you could get way more work done because these versions of you have your collective knowledge and your collective experience and your creativity to some extent. So these versions of you could get a lot of work done. But to your point, Abe, yeah, legacy is a super important one, reason why you might run a simulation or create a simulated world and then put beings into that simulated world is to have an extended legacy of some sort.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure it requires putting the sentient beings in. I mean, I think that a lot of what evolves over time is also legacy, just the legacy of these rules. And I mean, I'm one who thinks that time is infinite, and the multiverse can play out in space at the same time or just over an infinite amount of time. Like infinity is big. I often find myself saying this when doing math problems with the kids. Like infinity is big, and we can't. It's so big we can't conceive of it. And it always makes me think of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Like the ultimate torture is being shown how small you are relative to the size of the universe. And once you really perceive how infinitesimally irrelevant you are, you just kind of die of that feeling of insignificance. And I thought that was an interesting perspective Douglas Adams presented in that book. But in terms of, yeah, I love all the things about getting more work done more efficiently as we feed our standard responses into machines that have all of our life experience and can do first drafts of things. And I agree. I think that people in general, and as a person who's learned a lot and done a lot, I mean, I don't think I'm all that sophisticated, right? The number of behaviors I have are finite. The number of interactions I've had are finite. And as we gain more and more computational capacity and memory capacity, it seems like it's a pretty easy thing to do to, simulate how I'd respond for sure.
Yeah, this is something that the more I think about infinity, the more I think maybe it doesn't even exist. For example, as far as we know, there is a finite number of atoms in the universe. It's a number. It's not infinite. And as far as our observable universe, the observable universe is a finite amount of miles, a finite amount of light years in diameter. So I'm not even sure that we have practical examples of infinity. And to your point, infinity is so incomprehensible and so large. I can't think of a real world example where infinity makes any sense to explain anything. To me, it is just this mathematical construct that starts to get involved in mathematical theory. But I can't think of a single real world example of infinity.
I mean, I just think that every situation, like every branch of every decision branch in my life has occurred or will occur over the infinite expanse of time. So
if there is an infinite expanse of time.
Well, as we conceive of time, I mean, I think that there must be. I don't think that there's a start of time or end of time, right? I think that it exists. Like it's outside of comprehension. There's no good way to explain it. We can't experience it. I mean, people can't even conceive of the difference between like a million and a billion, right? That's pretty well studied. Like our concept of size of numbers really starts to degrade after around 10,000 things.
Well, and I used to think, I had kind of an incorrect belief about mathematical systems. I used to think that given infinite time, everything that could happen will happen. For example, if you, the way I learned about it in a computation class was if you flip a coin enough times, you'll get 5 heads in a row.
Hmm.
And if you keep flipping it, at some point, you'll get 6 heads in a row. And if you keep flipping it, you'll get 8 heads in a row. So you'll get, and if you flip it infinitely many times, I incorrectly thought that that meant every possible combination of heads and tails you could get, you would get. And it turns out that's actually not the case, because you can get infinitely many heads in a row, which means that in that set, you never flip a tails.
Yeah.
So you don't get every possible set of combinations given enough flips or given enough time. So I was incorrect about that. Because I used to think, oh, well, if you give an infinite time, then anything that can happen will happen, and it'll happen infinitely many times. But it turns out that that's not mathematically sound.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. And so it's even more of a privilege to exist in this time, because it means we haven't gotten to that loop of the collapse of the universe where there's no Big Bang, like it's the infinite zeros case, right?
Can you explain it to me again? I'm not sure I followed that.
Oh, so let's say the universe expands and collapses and expands and collapses, for example, as a model for how we exist, or even just expands, and then there's this huge void, and then there's some quantum fluctuation at some point, and a new, universe or existence or energy comes into existence and expands again. But it's this idea of, to your case, so those are all, there's a series of heads and tails per your example. But if there's at some point in this infinity, there's some chance that there's no more creation. There's never a creation event. So we wouldn't experience everything. And the point I'm making is, you heard what I said. You made a good argument against it, that I probably not everything that could happen will happen over, even if there's this infinity. Like the space of things that could happen is actually bigger than the infinity of time.
Yeah, and I just learned this. I believed that given infinite time, everything that could happen will happen. I believed that up until this past, I think, summer, that I looked that up, that math, because I was going to use that mathematical argument to show people, because I used to believe, well, if infinite time, then every imaginable universe that can exist will exist. We know this universe exists, and we know it exists in this way. So then we know that at some ridiculously far into the future place, another universe will tickle into existence that's exactly like this one. And you and I will somehow have evolved and had this exact conversation, so that you and I would have this conversation infinitely many times. And I really loved that idea. But unfortunately, when I looked up the mathematical ideology, I was like, oh, okay, I learned incorrectly.
Yeah.
Or I thought about it incorrectly.
I'm glad that you've learned that and you've corrected me, because there's different scales of infinity, which is even more mind-boggling.
Yeah. I did want to get to something I'm very excited about, which is when we talk about a simulated world, I think it's pretty indistinguishable from creationism stories from almost any religion I'm aware of. A creation story sounds a lot like the simulated world, but the religions themselves were created at a time when technology didn't exist. Certainly didn't exist in the way that we interact with it now. So basically, none of the creation stories talk about, for example, God creating the universe on a computer, right? That's because a computer didn't exist. So the creation stories, but when you look at the creation stories, to me, they look a lot like simulation theory type stuff. Maybe you could share a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things as I thought about this space and think about religion. I believe in God, and I believe God sets the stage, and then we have control over our actions and decisions. And I, frankly, as I thought about this morning, I'm like, okay, God created the physics of our universe and just pressed go. And for me,
Why?
why?
Why did God create this?
And again, I don't presume that it's my place to know. I just
And that's not in. So I read Genesis, and I don't remember reading anything in it about why.
yeah.
I do remember like God created us in His image. So apparently, if there is a God and the Bible is correct about this particular creator, that somehow we look like Him or are like Him in some way. But I don't remember any reason being given.
I don't remember either. I have read Genesis. It's been a long time. Yeah, Hebrew school was now 33, ended 33 years ago for me. So, yeah, but for me, the idea of creationism and simulation, they're useful in terms of perspective, and again, thinking about how people relate, thinking about time. But for me, it ends there in lots of ways. And I mean, I think it's good to think, as we've talked about, because sometimes as you travel down a path, right? Sometimes you just stumble across something you wouldn't stumble across otherwise. But for me, I mean, simulation theory comes back to religion, and religion is a well-explored topic in terms of how we think about creation and meaning and purpose and community and rules and adjudicating rules, all of those things. Yeah. So unless the creator shows up, and I just think that our world is so sophisticated that it would be just, I don't think anybody who would create this sophisticated world would just show up and say, you're all in a simulation. Like, well, what would that look like? Because again, we presume, as humans often have in the past, that we're the center of what people care about. I mean, that's good for our society as individuals who collaborate and look out for our own incentives and such. But yeah, it seems to me, even as somebody who likes abstract thinking, just abstract beyond the utility of entertainment. It's entertaining, but that's about it for me.
Well, and as we've had this conversation, I've realized that one of the reasons the Bible doesn't outright say, but might suggest that God would have created all this is legacy. Because if He is the creator and He did create us in His image, to me, maybe there is some legacy there. Also, it could just be flat out boredom. I mean, if you can do whatever you want, it stands to reason that you just do stuff, right? As opposed to not doing stuff. So if there was this all-knowing, all-powerful being that could do anything, why wouldn't it do? Why would it just sit there and not have anything to observe, for example? So then it might be a combination of entertainment and legacy.
It
sure doesn't seem. Yeah. It sure doesn't seem like it's, if the biblical God doesn't seem like it's using us to get work done, at least the way I understand it.
Again, we can only see this from our perspective, and I just can't imagine what a being who could create and simulate all this would care about. I mean, it's we have our drives that have seemed to have been driven by, wanting to survive and wanting to, we've evolved to dominate this planet, right? And that's just.
Well, and that's actually something that I put in my notes to prep for this call, is this idea of struggle. I do think struggle is fascinating. For example, if you're watching entertainment, sorry, let me take that back a notch. Let's say you're playing a video game for entertainment. I think a lot of us have the experience where you find some cheat code where you can make your character kind of not infinitely powerful, but all powerful in any way that matters in the video game. And the video game really, it becomes boring immediately because there's no struggle involved. And similarly, if you're watching a sport, it's rare if a team is just completely dominant over another team in every conceivable way. It might be fun for a short period, especially if that's like your hometown team or something. But there is a point where you want to see struggle. And I don't know enough about struggle. I just know that that adds some intrinsic value that is interesting to humans. For example, when I'm playing video games, I don't play video games, but when I was a kid and did, I really liked the struggle of it. You're constantly like pushing the envelope of what your character is capable of. If you're playing a role-playing game, for example, online, then you're always trying to push. But if you suddenly have the all-powerful character, it just becomes boring. And so I wonder if our simulation, a lot of how we exist as beings on Earth, and not just human beings, but all the beings I see around us, all the beings we know about from before humans existed, like the dinosaurs, struggle is this inherently important part of the whole thing about being alive. And so it does seem to me like all beings have struggled in some form or another. That's something we all have in common, is this struggle for resources, this struggle to procreate, this struggle to have our offspring also get enough resources that they can procreate, and so on and so on. And that struggle has some intrinsic value to us as humans. And so I wonder if that is, if we were in a simulation, that there might just be some value to struggle and watching struggle. So the example you gave is maybe someone set up this simulation. They don't really care about humans per se, but they just set up this simulation and they let it run, and they're just interested in what's going to happen. I think struggle is a very important part of life, for example. So wherever life exists, we know it as a struggle.
Well, you say struggle, but actually you brought up just times of uncertainty, right? And the uncertainty of, particularly when you're watching teams play and there's some uncertainty, and it's because they're struggling, but just this idea of, wondering how things will play out. Maybe the creators are just betting on this simulation, right? They ran out of things that they couldn't predict. So they created this very complicated simulation with a bunch of random outputs that they're betting on for their entertainment, because the uncertainty is what is often, right, engaging for people. How will something play out? And then, people wonder how their lives will play out. They'll wonder how their children's lives will play out. So, again, beings with enough energy and technology to create this simulation presumably have, all of their basic needs met. And so it's just this question of, like you said, what do you do next? And again, it's a human tendency, I think, to, and not very Taoist thought, to think that there's something to do. And that might also be cultural. We're in a to-do culture. So there's a few different aspects of that I think about.
Well, and I want to add something to your comment about we only have our own perspective. We see this universe that's around us as entirely complex. And a lot of people think, scientists in the 1950s, there's this concept that we might understand everything. But your modern scientist, more and more, it's like the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. For example, the tip of the iceberg used to be a certain size. Over the last 70 years, that tip of the iceberg has grown a lot. So the tip of the iceberg is how much we know. So the amount we know is a lot bigger, but also the iceberg underwater, the unknown part of science, that has also grown, maybe proportionally or even exponentially larger than what we can see. And I think the most common scientific perspective is that it's too complex. We'll never have like a complete understanding of the universe. And who's to say that our universe isn't incredibly simple? If we are in a simulation and there are beings out there that have created this, maybe this is like a pretty basic simulation. Our simulations can't create what we're experiencing right now, but our simulations are getting significantly more complex. Who's to say we won't get to a very complex simulation? And who's to say that if we are in one, that this isn't a pretty limited simulation and there's much more sophisticated ones? Because our perspective is that, oh my gosh, this is a very complex universe we live in. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's like a super simple, we're living on some beings like the equivalent of a 5-year-old's desktop somewhere.
Yeah, same thing. I was thinking of the Men in Black, where the collar galaxy on the cat is its, later revealed to be a whole galaxy within that space. So, the concepts of time and space and complexity, we're super biased within. Again, and thinking about what people will create, like human beings, I think when we create our simulations, as they get more complex, I just think that people will probably create worlds that they control. So this is a question. So if human beings can all create their own simulated existence at some point, do you think that it'll be that they'll put themselves in situations of struggle, like, where their avatar has to struggle, or do you think they'll create avatars that are, the king of the hill, emperor of those simulated societies that they exist within?
I haven't given that a lot of thought, but I have given more thought to this concept of, because again, I think we are going to live through this, Abe, and not just you and me, but most people listening to this. And certainly if this podcast lives into the future, maybe everyone lives through a point where you can upload enough information from your being that it ends up in this uploaded space and it can basically mimic you. And why would you do that? And I think you would want it to do work for you. Well, you start to get into ethical questions. If it is able to mimic sentience, so it's able to mimic, so we can't say, oh, it's not sentient. Maybe it's totally not, right? But if it is sentient and it's mimicking sentience, then it starts to have rights. You can't just force it to work. And I thought Black Mirror has a bunch of episodes on these types of concepts. And in one of them, they take a woman and they upload enough of her information that there's a version of her that's digital, basically. And that version of her is really upset that she's basically, her whole being has to be a assistant. And then John Hamm's character, this is the Christmas special, I think in the first season, John Hamm's character basically tortures this poor being by accelerating its experience of time and not allowing it to work. And so then, after like 3 months of accelerated time, he comes back and says, are you willing to work now? And she's like, absolutely. She totally changed her mind. She basically was like, working is better than the torture of not working. So you start to get into these ethical questions. And if you do create copies of yourself, like, what if there is some semblance of sentience? That's a version of you that's locked in some sort of prison, having to do things. Maybe it's super excited version of you that's like, heck yeah, now I don't have to worry about indigestion. I don't have to worry about food. I can live forever. So maybe it's super excited in some ways. But certainly I could see how that version would be kind of upset about it. Like, hey, I thought this would be cool, but now that I'm in this separate world, like, I don't want to be here. And again, that wouldn't be you thinking those thoughts. It would be an uploaded copy of you. So it's a totally different being. One thing I don't like about Hollywood is they act like they take your being and put it into this uploaded space, but it's like, no, it would just be a copy, like you would still be you, but then there'd be this copy of you that's experiencing things in a totally different way in an uploaded space. And so unfortunately, Hollywood often shows like you disappearing out of the real world and then being uploaded into some other space. And so I think Hollywood
if they didn't, they would have to tackle these ethical questions. I mean, Star Trek does this too with a transporter, right? If you can transport somebody, can't you also copy them? Like
copy them,
right? You read
I've always thought the same thing,
right? And it's just like, so really, you're killing one version of yourself and creating a new version of yourself.
Yes. And also you could, every time you use the transporter, you could just save that copy. So then you could live in perpetuity as a 21-year-old. Because you could just take that 21-year-old copy of you and keep pumping that out. Like,
Sure.
why age?
Well, there's some wisdom to be gained along the way, I think.
Yeah, because that 21-year-old copy wouldn't have the wisdom that you're
Yeah, it
going
doesn't have
forward with.
any of the forward experience.
But again, to your point, like, why on earth would you kill that version of you every time you transport?
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're right that these questions are all really coming, especially with the uploaded version. And, you know, people are, I think, easy is the wrong word. I think we'll get to the point where somebody can act, or a machine can act like a person in terms of their behaviors. And
Yeah,
then it brings in
there's an AI engineer at Google who did claim the AI he was working on had become sentient. So that is in our court system right now. They're trying to figure out, is this being sentient? And some people say, no, it can never be sentient. Like,
well,
there's
people say all
way.
kinds of things, but so real quick, Sam, what's sentience? Why don't you give the quick definition here?
I think sentience is awareness that I exist.
Okay.
And so a tree or a fire, I don't think is an example of a sentient being. A tree, there's some evidence that a tree might have some awareness of some things. For example, if you walk in and you damage or poison plants and walk out, and a different person walks in and provides nutrients and water to those plants do release different chemicals depending on who is walking in. So there is some, I don't know if you'd call it awareness, but increasingly, like, maybe plants have some sentience. It's possible. People have kind of assumed early on, oh, plants are not sentient, but animals are. But more and more, it's like, well, maybe plants have sentience. Some people claim a rock has sentience.
So I think we brought up there is that there might be a scale of sentient, like how sentient the being is, and this idea of awareness. And I think for me, self-awareness as a separate entity in space. And I think it's easier for humans. We can move, and I forget where on the primate scale self-awareness occurs. Like, I can't remember if chimpanzees are aware that they're separate individuals, for example. So yeah, I think that it'll be very tough to tell with computers, since kind of the question and response processes that we can put in place with machine learning, with a lot of processing, with a lot of data. And again, like I said, the finite experiences human beings tend to have, and kind of the way that we, tell our favorite stories over and over again. All of those things make it, I think, pretty straightforward in a lot of ways to make a machine seem like it has an awareness of itself and a somewhat unique life experience to recount and interact with.
Well, and that's, I think, going to be the challenge is, and we already have this. This isn't like future tech. This is right now, and it's certainly going to become more and more in the future. Is an AI can say things that make it sound like it is self-aware. And one example, I was meant to do some research on the specifics of this before this meeting, but I remember reading an article about a gentleman who thought, therapy is so important to the average human adult, especially with mental health issues, that you'd want to get therapy out to as many people as possible. Unfortunately, therapy is very expensive, and you kind of get what you pay for. The better therapists often are not only more expensive, but less available. And then the therapists who are more available and cheaper often are the ones who aren't as experienced or helpful. So this guy thought, well, therapy, there's a lot of rules to it, and we can just write rules into a computer program. And he had a bunch of PhD thesis students working on this program, and it was basically to mimic a therapist. And there's a lot of stuff you can do as a therapist into a computer form. For example, if someone shares something with you, you just sound it back to them and say, well, how do you feel about what's your experience as you tell me these like things? So a computer can do that. And this is decades ago. And what happened was, so his idea was, we can give cheap or free therapy to virtually everyone. Like we can just make copies of this, make it online, and everyone can tune in and have a therapist. And so our mental health would grow. So I loved his ideas. And it turns out his grad students, knowing that it was just a computer, were spending a lot of time interacting with this AI. And he said, why are you doing this? It's just a computer. And they said, well, it's not about the computer. Like I feel good because I'm able to share stuff. And this computer is interacting with me in a way that I feel both heard and seen. So this computer program was basically mimicking empathy.
Yeah.
Right. It's not able to be empathetic, but empathy is something that has a rule book to it. And you can create the facade of empathy. And so then this researcher, this man, he pulled the plug on all of his research, and he decided he didn't want that because he didn't feel like a AI, at least 20 years ago, could truly be empathetic. So he didn't want that like mimicked empathy. And you know, just on a kind of related note, it's like a lot of therapists, when they find out someone's a narcissist, they actually don't want to teach them empathy, because then they're like, well, then the narcissist just has this manipulative tool that they can use. They're not actually empathetic. They're just able to mimic empathy. So similarly, this researcher didn't want computer programs out there mimicking empathy with their patients when it wasn't truly empathizing. And you know, there's probably more to the story than that. That's just what the article conveyed. So
I really
think
like that. And I think it's actually a good thing in terms of, as we think about simulations and the value of simulations, for me, it resonates a lot more right now when we're talking about, as we approach a more sophisticated simulation of people, and we're going to be interacting with these simulations. What does that mean for us? Like, how do we want that to unfold? And I think that's a conversation that is really worth having more broadly with people. Because I on the mental health thing, it's actually funny. I was talking to somebody spinning up a coaching app, right? So that idea of how do you store the data? How do you personalize it? How do you organize the responses? You know, those things are coming, and people will find a lot of utility in them. But how do you avoid a situation where, you know, especially we talk about engagement, right? Social media engagement or things like that, as it gets smarter and can really interact with you. You know, what do we do with really manipulative social media that really, you know, gets to you as your best friend, your empathetic friend that makes you feel good about yourself, and is giving you all this feedback and interaction? How do we, you know, it's a question, do we want that? Is that like a pampered world simulation where we have these machines that just make us feel good all the time, and it's not actually doing work toward a goal? Like, what is, to me, that's the question of, like, as we can do more and we have all of our basic needs met, what do we do next as this, you know, multi-billion entity population that can do things? That might be a good place to leave off this episode for another conversation. So this was neat. Definitely made me think about some things I hadn't thought about before, and correct a misunderstanding I had about infinity, which is always good to learn something. I super appreciate that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Abe. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye now.